They say the frontier doesn't give warnings. It just decides. One moment you're counting losses. The next you're standing at the edge of a choice that will either damn you or define you. Ezekiel Marsh didn't know it yet, but before the sun set, his life would be claimed by 2 dying giants and a debt written in blood. The storm had already moved east, leaving the land scraped raw and steaming. But what Ezekiel found in his yard made the thunder feel merciful by comparison. 2 Apache women lay sprawled near his dying cattle, motionless in the churned mud. At first glance, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. These were not ordinary women. Even collapsed in the dirt, they were immense. One was shorter, though short was a lie of convenience. She still stood taller than most men when upright, easily over 6 feet. Her body built thick with muscle hardened by war and survival. The other was something else entirely. A true giant, nearly 7 feet of solid bone and power. Shoulders so broad they seemed carved from the land itself. Ezekiel had heard stories, whispered around campfires and trading posts, about Apache women like these. Warrior daughters of chiefs, raised not only to fight but to carry bloodlines that mattered. Legends didn't show up alone. Legends didn't collapse on a failing ranch 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. Their clothing was torn and soaked dark with blood. Intricate beadwork marked them as highborn, jewelry flashing even through the grime, ornaments worth more than everything. Ezekiel owned, nailed down or not, blood seeped steadily from the ribs of the smaller giant, staining the earth beneath her. The taller woman's breathing came slow and uneven. Each gasp dragged from her chest like it hurt to exist. Whatever had driven them here had been violent enough to scatter their protection and leave them half dead. Ezekiel felt every instinct he'd sharpened. Over years on the frontier scream the same truth. Helping Apache meant death, not metaphorical death, not eventual consequences, real fast, ugly death. Settlers had been hanged for less, shot in the back, left on post as warnings. Then the larger woman's eyes opened. They locked onto his with terrifying clarity. Ezekiel braced himself for rage, for hatred, for the promise of violence he'd been taught to expect. Instead, he saw fear, raw human fear, the same kind he felt every morning when he looked at his dying land and knew he was losing a battle he couldn't win. She tried to speak, her voice deep and commanding even through weakness, but only a whisper in her own tongue escaped, before her eyes rolled back and she slipped into darkness again. Standing there, staring down at 2 fallen giants who could crush him with their bare hands, Ezekiel understood that the next 3 minutes would brand him forever. Fool or something else, coward or man. 2 dying women, 1 decision. He knelt beside them, hands shaking as he forced himself to focus on injuries instead of consequences. Up close, their size was even more unsettling. The smaller one stretched nearly 6.5 feet, her arms thick as fence posts, her chest rising in ragged bursts. Something sharp had torn into her ribs, branch, blade. He couldn't tell, and dark blood pooled beneath her. The larger woman had a deep gash across her forehead. Blood crusted into her hair, but her eyes fluttered open again, tracking him with dangerous awareness. Even wounded, she radiated the kind of strength that made men cautious. His ranch sat isolated beyond reason. 40 miles to town, 15 to the nearest soul. Out here, there were no witnesses and no mercy. The smaller woman's breathing faltered, then hitched. Ezekiel had watched too many animals die not to recognize it. She had maybe an hour, maybe less. Please. The giant woman's whisper came in broken English, low and steady despite the pain. Help. Sister. The word slammed into him harder than any threat. Elizabeth's face flashed in his mind. His own sister, buried 3 winters ago after a fever burned through her faster than he could pray. These women weren't just strangers. They were sisters. And they were royalty. Their disappearance would bring warriors, questions, blood. Thunder rumbled again, distant but closing fast. Another storm, another countdown. Ezekiel looked at his cabin, then back at the women. His neighbors would eventually find bodies and assume he'd defended himself. That story would save him, might even earn him praise. But when he met the larger woman's eyes again, saw the calm acceptance there instead of pleading, something inside him fractured. This isn't about Apache or settler, he muttered. It's about people. He slid his arms beneath the smaller woman's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle weighing more than a grown steer. The larger woman forced herself upright, swaying, but she moved to help without hesitation, her towering height making Ezekiel feel like a child beside her. Step by step, they hauled the wounded sister toward the cabin. Each movement felt like walking closer to an edge he couldn't see the bottom of. The wind rose, carrying rain and dust and something else. Movement. Shapes on the southern ridge. As they reached the doorway, Ezekiel realized the truth too late. His door was too narrow. The wounded woman's shoulders wouldn't fit. They turned her carefully, easing her sideways every second in agony. "They come," the larger woman whispered, eyes fixed on the horizon. Riders appeared like wolves against the sky. Ezekiel shoved the door closed behind them and peered through a shutter crack. 5 Apache warriors sat their horses still as stone, scanning the valley. Even from here, he could see war paint and rifle stocks. "Your sister," he whispered to the conscious giant. "Why are they hunting you?" Her jaw set as she pressed cloth to the wound. She spoke against marriage. Chief's son wanted her. She said no. That was it. Refusal. Ezekiel thought of all the times he'd said no in his own life without consequence. Freedom he'd never questioned. The lead warrior pointed toward the cabin. They'd found the blood trail. "How many bullets?" the woman asked quietly, checking the knife at her belt. Ezekiel counted. 12 rifle rounds. 6 pistol. Against 5 men who knew this land better than he ever would. Not enough. The wounded woman stirred, speaking urgently in Apache. The larger sister's expression darkened. "They not here for us," she said slowly. "They here for you." The words made no sense until she continued. 3 moons ago, a girl by the river. White man helped her. Ezekiel's breath caught. The memory came sharp and clear. A half-drowned child tangled in branches, fevered and fading. He'd stayed until she could walk, then guided her toward Apache land and left without a name. "She was Chief's daughter," the woman said. "Some warriors doubt her story. They come to test it." Hooves closed in. A voice called out, demanding. The giant woman's hand closed around Ezekiel's arm. "What you do now decides everything." The door shook under a fist. "White man, come out." Ezekiel's hands trembled on his rifle. "Tell them truth," she said. "Tell your name." It was a gamble on honor in a world that rarely rewarded it. But there was no time left. "My name is Ezekiel Marsh," he called. "I saved Chief Nailish's daughter." Silence fell like a held breath. Then, "Come out! Bring the women." They stepped into the open together. The warriors watched with something close to respect. The leader studied Ezekiel. "You smaller than she said." Ezekiel almost smiled. "I just helped." The leader turned to the women. "Chief comes at sunrise. You wait." The warriors vanished back into the dark, leaving Ezekiel staring at the longest night of his life. Inside, lamplight revealed the truth of the wounds. Bleeding slowed. Infection threatened. Politics hovered like a blade. "Peace worth more than one white man's life," the woman said honestly. Ezekiel understood. Silence settled. Coyotes cried. Near midnight, the wounded sister woke clearer. "Thank you," she said carefully. "You different." The words carried weight. Ayana, she'd given her name, watched him with something like evaluation. "We watch you," she said. "How you choose." Heat crept into his chest, unwelcome and dangerous. Then horses moved outside. Not Apache, badges, lawmen. Ezekiel stepped out alone, blocking the door with his body. Lies crumbled under scrutiny. Blood patterns, footprints too large to deny. "Step aside," the marshal ordered. Ezekiel made his choice. There are Apache here. 2 injured women. The gun came up. Death hovered. Then another shout, riders approaching, reinforcements, more marshals. The net closed. Ayana stepped out voluntarily, towering, commanding. "I am daughter of Chief Nailish." Even hardened men faltered. Blood debt was claimed. Treaty law spoken aloud. Doubt crept in. They waited for morning. When dawn broke, dust rose again. This time it was the chief. Dawn didn't arrive gently. It came hard and bright, scraping the night off the land like a blade across bone. And it found Ezekiel Marsh, standing in his doorway with dust in, his teeth in judgment riding straight toward him. The long hours before sunrise had stretched into something unreal. Time pulled thin by fear and waiting. Federal marshals paced his yard with restless purpose, boots crunching dirt, rifles never far from ready. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with lamplight smoke. Blood and the quiet breathing of 2 giant women who had trusted, Him when trust could have killed them all. Ayanna stood near the door, her massive frame unyielding despite exhaustion, while Etel rested against the wall. Fever eased, but danger still written in every shallow rise of her chest. None of them spoke when the sound finally came. Hooves. Many, but controlled. Not a charge. An arrival. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, squinting into the growing light as dust clouds lifted on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called out, forcing confidence into his voice. "Because if it's a war party, this ends ugly." Ayanna straightened to her full height, nearly 7 feet of muscle and authority framed by the morning sun. "My father comes as promised," she said evenly. "He speaks law to law." The riders appeared gradually, resolving into figures as the distance closed. Not an army. 5 elders rode with deliberate calm, faces painted not for war but for ceremony. At their center rode a man who carried himself like the land itself had learned to obey him. Chief Nailish dismounted with measured dignity, eyes sharp and assessing, taking in the marshals, the weapons, the cabin, and finally Ezekiel. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in flawless English, speaking the name as if he'd always known it. "You hold my daughters as prisoners." Kane bristled, badge flashing as he stepped forward. "Your daughters are suspects in the Morrison killings. Federal law recognizes treaty," Nailish interrupted calmly. "Treaty recognizes Apache law where Apache people are concerned." Kane's jaw tightened. "They murdered settlers." "Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters," Nailish replied, his tone never rising. "They defended honor. Apache law allows this." Words replaced gunfire, each sentence placed with care. Ezekiel watched, heart hammering as 2 worlds collided without touching steel. Kane shifted tactics. "Even if that's true, this rancher harbored fugitives." Nailish's gaze turned to Ezekiel, heavy and searching. "You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from the river." Ezekiel swallowed. "Yes. For this," the chief said, voice carrying across the yard. "Apache law binds me with blood debt, life for life." Murmurs moved through the elders. Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, a silent shield. "He saved us too," she said formally. "Nailish," nodded, then reached into his saddlebag. When the necklace emerged, bone and silver, carved with symbols Ezekiel didn't understand, the yard went still. "3 lives create obligation beyond debt," Nailish declared. "I adopt you as my son." The world lurched. Kane sputtered protests about territory and authority, but Nailish moved faster, invoking treaty clauses with precision that left the marshal floundering. The necklace settled around Ezekiel's neck, heavy as both chain and crown. Kane holstered his weapon, fury simmering behind his eyes. "This isn't over. Let it continue," Nailish said softly. "Law is patient." When the elders withdrew, the ranch felt changed, as if lines had been redrawn overnight. The marshals remained, wary but constrained, until finally retreating with warnings that rang hollow against treaty words. Only when the yard was empty again did Ezekiel feel the tremor in his legs. Adoption, son, protection bought with obligation. Nailish paused before leaving, eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I return with different decision." Then he was gone, leaving questions heavier than answers. The days that followed reshaped Ezekiel's world piece by piece. Word traveled faster than dust storms. Apache families came cautiously at first, then openly bringing hides, tools, grain, stories. Ezekiel's failing ranch became neutral ground under treaty protection, a place where trade replaced threat. Etel proved sharp-minded and deliberate, negotiating exchanges with calm authority that made even stubborn settlers listen. Ayanna's strength transformed the land itself. She lifted beams alone that would have broken teams of men, set fences straight with patient force, and worked dawn to dusk without complaint. Watching her move was like watching purpose given form. Ezekiel felt it every day, the pull he shouldn't feel, the awareness that Apache law had named her sister and made desire a crime. Etel noticed before he spoke it aloud. "Adoption protects," she said one evening, her voice gentle but knowing. "But protection can become prison." Ezekiel said nothing, but the truth settled deep. When Nailish returned, ceremony rode with him. He dismounted before Ezekiel and studied him for a long moment. "You honored adoption," he said. "You brought peace and trade." Then his gaze shifted to Ayanna, and Ezekiel felt his chest tighten. Old men solve one problem and make another. Ayanna stepped forward, towering even her father, voice steady. I choose to speak. Nalish inclined his head. Speak. This man has honor, she said, but my heart does not see him as brother. Silence fell heavy. Nalish's lips curved into a knowing smile. Apache law has answer. He turned to Itel. Do you release? Itel straightened, a grin breaking her severity. I release him. Nalish raised his staff. Then I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. The words struck like thunder. But if he chooses, he may become my son by marriage. Ezekiel barely found his voice. I choose. The ceremony that followed bound two worlds without breaking either. Federal officials watched powerless as law bent toward peace. Ayanna stood radiant in tradition and strength, choosing love with the same courage she chose battle. Months later, Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct the expansion of their home, sunlight catching her hair, and understood that destiny sometimes arrives disguised as fear. The giants who had fallen in his yard had lifted his life into something larger than he'd ever imagined. Morning light spilled across the valley like a promise finally kept, and Ezekiel Marsh stood in his yard, wearing the bone and silver necklace that had already rewritten his fate once. The dust from approaching horses rose slowly this time, not as threat but as ceremony, and beside him Ayanna stood in all her towering strength, nearly 7 feet of calm power, her shadow stretching long across the ground. Months had passed since the night that should have ended him. Months since fear, law, and blood debt had tangled his life into something unrecognizable. His ranch was no longer a place of quiet failure. It had become a living crossroads. Apache families arrived openly now, trading hides and grain for tools and goods under treaty protection. White settlers came too, cautiously at first, then with growing trust. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. Yet for all the prosperity, Ezekiel carried a weight that no success could lift. Every day working beside Ayanna sharpened what he was not allowed to want. Apache law had named her sister. Apache honor had made that bond absolute. And still every look, every shared silence carved deeper than fear ever had. Chief Nalish dismounted with deliberate grace, elders following, their presence heavy with meaning. Ezekiel felt his heart begin to race long before the chief spoke. My son, Nalish said, voice carrying across the yard, you have honored adoption. You protected my people. You brought balance where there was conflict. His gaze shifted, slow and knowing, between Ezekiel and Ayanna. But old men learn this truth late. One law can heal the body while wounding the heart. Ezekiel swallowed. The unspoken laid bare in the open air. Ayanna stepped forward, her height commanding attention without effort. Chief, she said formally, I choose to speak. Nalish inclined his head. Speak, daughter. Her voice was steady, but Ezekiel heard the courage beneath it. This man has shown honor beyond words. He stood when standing meant death. He chose mercy when mercy had no reward. But my heart does not see him as brother. The silence that followed felt endless. Nalish studied her, then Ezekiel, and a faint smile touched his weathered face. Apache law has many paths, he said. Adoption solves one problem. Release can solve another. He turned to Etel, who stood nearby, her massive frame relaxed, eyes bright with quiet amusement. Do you release Ezekiel Marsh from family bond? Etel did not hesitate. I release him. He has earned his choice. Nalish lifted his staff, voice ringing with finality. Then I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. He is no longer my son by law. The words struck like thunder, stripping protection even as they opened a door. Nalish continued unhurried. But if he chooses, he may become my son by marriage, not by debt. Ezekiel felt the world narrow to Ayanna's eyes. I choose, he said, voice firm despite the storm in his chest. Ayanna's answer was a simple nod, heavy with everything they had endured. The ceremony bound two worlds without tearing either apart. Apache tradition wove seamlessly with territorial law, witnesses from both sides standing in stunned silence as vows were spoken that carried the weight of history. Federal authorities watched powerless now, their investigations dissolved under treaties they could not break without war. Ayanna stood radiant, a giant among women, deadly and beautiful, choosing love with the same courage she chose battle. Etel's laughter rang across the valley as she stood witness, pride unmistakable. In the months that followed, the ranch flourished into something larger than Ezekiel had ever dreamed. Buildings rose where scrub once choked the land, lifted into place by Ayana's strength and guided by her sharp mind. Trade flowed steady and fair. Stories spread across the territory about the giant Apache sisters and the white man who had stood between worlds and refused to fall. Federal scrutiny faded when Washington realized peace was more valuable than pride. What had begun as a choice measured in minutes became a life measured in meaning. 6 months later, Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct construction of their expanded home. Sunlight catching in her hair, her voice calm and certain as men twice her number followed, her lead without question. He understood then that some blessings arrive wrapped in fear. That destiny often wears the face of impossible complication. The giants who had collapsed in his yard had not brought destruction. They had brought him a place in a world far larger than the one he had been losing. Strength had found peace, law had bowed to honor, and a frontier that only knew division had learned, if only in one quiet valley, what unity could look like.